Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday. Erev Shabbos Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. It's great to be back with you. Missed you last week. Who's in the house on a Friday? Guy in Ohio, Shandor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Gordo in Scotland, Renee in Indiana, and let's go Dodgers! A girl, Renee, very good. Go Blue! I just posted a joke that references the Dodgers. Joseph in Sierra Nevada, Paul in the Great Northwest, Yehudit in South Carolina, Chaim in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Franco in Trieste, and Elise in Virginia, and Mary in San Antonio. Welcome, everybody. Give me a second. I just had to do one thing of housekeeping that I couldn't do while the music was playing, is just to sign into this document that I will use to receive notes a little bit later. Yes, it's me, because I guess I wasn't signed in for a week. There we go. Now I'm signed in to Google. Will it let me do that? Come on. Reload. Sign into that. What? Sorry. Can we sign in now? Questions and comments. Okay, great. All right, doubled off today. A great time to do it. We are now, of course, because I was away, a few pages behind, but we will catch up. Not to worry. In fact, today we're going to finish, with God's help, chapter 2 and open chapter 3. Right now we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 5 in chapter 2. Our dafs today are pages 31 and 32 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. And here in chapter 2, we're finishing up our discussion of what could disqualify an offering being brought in the temple when the temple was standing in Jerusalem. It's been a couple thousand years, but we still study it just as diligently. And God willing, the third temple will go up soon with the coming of Mashiach. So in chapter 1, it was more problems of having the wrong intention. Here in chapter 2, it's more problems of a person who is disqualified, bringing the offering, or having or mixing intentions at different in different elements of bringing a sacrifice. So remember, we have to slaughter it, collect its blood, right? The blood of the soul, the blood with which that when the animal is slaughtered, the blood that pours out and its life goes with it, that's called the blood of the soul. That has to be collected by a priest who is fit in a service vessel, conveyed to the altar, and it's the sprinkling of the blood on the altar that actually affects the atonement or fulfills the obligation if a person is obligated to bring an offering. For example, in the case of a sin offering or a burnt offering, it's one of the offerings that somebody has to bring occasionally. Usually burnt offerings are gift offerings, but sometimes they're obligated among the offerings that someone brings, for example, during a purification process of a mitzorah, somebody who had the skin condition known as tsaras, or a woman who's given birth, or a Nazir who completes his period of Naziris when he had vowed to abstain from products of the grapevine, or to attend the dead and to cut his hair, etc. Okay, it's been quite technical here at the end of chapter 2. We're still going to be in, the elements of offerings, but when we enter chapter 3, there's some really interesting stuff a little bit later today. Okay, here, right near the top of page 31a. So it was stated that if one had intent to eat half an olive bulk, right, so a ketzayis or a zayis is an olive, so it's the volume of an olive. And we've been talking about the concept of pigul, that if the one slaughtering or doing the blood services we just discussed has an intent to eat some of the permitted parts for eating of an offering, like a sin offering, parts of it were eaten by the priests. A peace offering, parts of it were eaten by the owner of the offering. But there was a deadline when it had to be eaten by. So if at the time of slaughter or other elements of the sacrificial service, somebody has an intent to eat beyond that deadline, so it's going to be disqualified even now at the outset because of that intent. Now, as always, when we're talking about Talmudic issues, when there is an action, like what is the minimum, aspect of that action, right? If you're talking about eating, okay, well, if you eat a crumb, is that actually eating? No, there's like a minimum volume that needs to be eaten for the word eating to even apply. Here we use the word consumption because there can be an intent to consume, where consumption includes not only eating by the person who's permitted to eat, but also by the altar. In the case of a burnt offering, right, that parts that needed to be burnt would be burned beyond the allotted time for the burning, and burning on the altar is considered, sort of heaven eating, right, consumption by the altar. Okay, but again, we have these minimum measures. And so what they're going to ask now is, well, what if you have a less than the minimum measure, but you have intent with respect to several portions of less than the minimum measure? Can we combine those less than the minimum measures together so that we would satisfy the minimum measure, and then would it qualify for as pigul, meaning that the offering would be disqualified because of this intention to eat beyond the deadline? So it was stated, if one had intent to eat half an olive bulk beyond the designated time, half an olive bulk outside its designated area, and another half of an olive bulk beyond its designated time. So Rava says, in such a case, the pigul awaked as one asleep, from Psalm 78:65. What are we talking about here? See, the issue is, if he had in mind to eat half an olive bulk beyond its designated time and half an olive bulk beyond its designated time, well, why wouldn't they combine? He's going to end up eating the minimum measure, the olive bulk, beyond its designated time. But he had 3 intents. All of them not permitted, but half an olive bulk beyond its time, half an olive bulk outside of its designated place, like outside the temple, which does not render an offering pigul, because there's different disqualifications associated with place as with time, since the Torah specifies it has to be eaten by a certain time, and place is inferred. As we've seen before, but then he adds that third faulty intention with respect to time again. So the question is does this intention to eat half an olive bulk outside of its place interrupt the 2 intentions having to do with time so that they can't combine together? It's a very interesting question and super Talmudic. It's just not the way we normally think. Right? So since, and how do we get that from Psalm 78:65? Well, since one had intent to consume 2/2 of an olive bulb beyond their designated time, these intentions are joined together, and the middle thought is disregarded, since it constitutes only half the requisite measure, and the offering would be rendered pigul. Right, since the one that's in between by itself doesn't amount to anything, it's less than the minimum measure to count as something, therefore it's not significant enough to interrupt the combination of the 2/2 with respect to time, and that's why it would be rendered pigul. And Rav Hamnuna says, no, it constitutes a combination of improper intentions. The middle thought, although itself insufficient to disqualify the offering, is sufficient to interfere with the intention to consume it beyond its time, and therefore the offering is not rendered pigul. Right? Pigul means that it's disqualified, and if somebody eats of it, it's a larger consequence than disqualified not by pigul. Rava said, from where, i.e., based on what, do I state my ruling? As we learned in a Mishna, Teharos 1:5, an egg bulk, okay, so now we're talking about a different volume, right? Again, different minimum measures depending on the area of the law that we're talking about. So the olive bulk, right, the ketzayis, is used here with respect to intentions in other areas as well. The egg bulk, the beitza, is going to be used in certain areas of impurity and whether we have enough of something to render something else impure. So from where do I base my ruling? As we learned in a Mishnah, an egg bulk of food with first degree tuma, ritual impurity, and an egg bulk of food with second degree tuma that one mixed together are collectively considered to have first degree impurity. And the difference between first degree and second degree, both are tameh, and therefore if we were talking about teruma, right, that consecrated food that only priests can eat, and both the food and the priest have to be tahor, ritually pure. First degree impurity, if it comes into contact with other food, renders what was previously pure impure, right? Impure food that comes into contact with pure food, if it's first degree impurity, transmits that impurity to the food that it touched. Second degree impurity is impure and a priest can't eat it, but if it comes into contact with other food that's pure, it does not transmit its impurity. So here, an egg bulk of food with first degree impurity and an egg bulk of food with second degree impurity, and one mixed them together, so collectively they have first degree impurity. But if one, because there's the minimum measure in there, there is one egg bulk of impure food in that combination. But if one separated them into two portions, each containing a homogeneous mixture, but what are they made out of? Right? Each one has within it half an egg bulk of first degree impurity and half an egg bulk of second degree impurity. So this portion is considered to have second degree impurity, and that portion is considered to have second degree impurity, since neither portion has the minimum measure of first degree impurity. Since neither of them contains the requisite amount of food with first degree impurity, each mixture settles to the lower level of impurity between the two foods. And Rava reasoned, but if one mixed them again, they revert to be of first degree impurity. So what he's saying is, even though, the guy at the time of slaughter had intention to eat half a ketzayis beyond its allotted time, half a ketzayis outside its place, and another half a ketzayis outside its time, the fact is, all taken all together, there was a full ketzayis outside its time, and that's why it should be pigul. From where do I know this about the egg bulks and impurity? From where do I know this? From the fact that the latter clause of that Mishnah teaches if this portion fell by itself and that portion fell by itself onto a loaf of teruma, it disqualifies it, as would any food with second degree impurity. But it does not render it impure. Disqualified, but not impure, because it was second-degree impurity, since only foods with first-degree impurity impart impurity to other foods. But if they both fell simultaneously onto the loaf, they render it a food with second-degree impurity, because together they have enough of the requisite measure to a first-degree impurity to impart its impurity and therefore create second-degree impurity in the loaf. Fully impure, not just disqualified. So evidently, although the first degree impurity lay dormant for lack of a requisite minimum measure, it resurfaces when the rest of the measure is added, despite the fact that each portion was previously considered to have only second degree impurity. The law should be the same in the case of intent to consume the offering beyond its designated time, i.e., the intent to consume half a ketzayis, an olive bulk, outside the area does not interfere with the intent that creates the pigul, the heavier disqualification. And Rav Hamnuna says, no, the cases are different. There, in the case of Tuma, there is a requisite measure present at the outset, which was divided into two and then recombined. But here, in the case of the offering with regard to intent to consume it beyond its time, there is no requisite measure present at the outset to render it pigul. And Rav Hamnuna says, from where do I say my opinion? Well, as we learned in another Mishna, Tractate Meila 17b, the food that became tameh through contact with the primary source of Tuma, thereby assuming first-degree impurity, first-degree tuma, and the food that became tameh through contact with a derivative source of tuma, thereby assuming second-degree impurity, they join together to constitute the requisite measure of a beitza, an egg bulk, to impart tuma in accordance with the more lenient of the two, i.e., the food has second-degree tuma. What is it not that they retain second-degree tuma, even if one makes up the requisite measure again? So if so, it can be inferred that the first-degree tuma is lost, and it does not lie dormant or resurface. And here as well, the latter intent of pigul cannot restore the initial intent of pigul, as the intent to consume half an olive bulk, half a ketzayis, outside the area interfered. Right? So it's very interesting that you have to, we're basically saying he never had intent to eat the minimum measure outside the designated time, right? Because he initially in his head he thought, well, I'm going to, again, this is, how would this happen in the real world? Like the priest is thinking, okay, yeah, I'm going to eat some of this the day after tomorrow, but I'm only going to eat a little. Why would he think that, right? It doesn't matter. We're just talking about how do we, what is the definition of the law and what are the implications of the definition of that law. And so, since he had an intent to eat less than the minimum measure, that doesn't trigger pigul. Then he had another intent that he's going to eat less than the minimum measure outside of the temple. That doesn't involve pigul at all. It would disqualify if it was the minimum measure, but it's not the minimum measure. And then he goes on to a third thought, which again is less than the minimum measure. And we're not going to say that he says, yeah, I'm going to eat half a ketzayis outside the time and half a ketzayis outside the time. That might combine, and you could argue that it doesn't because he's having separate thoughts. But for sure they're separated by this intervening thought that has nothing to do with eating outside the designated time. So the Gemara responds to that argument by saying, well, perhaps the Mishna is referring specifically to a case where one does not complete the requisite measure again. And so that's why it wouldn't apply. But if he did complete the requisite measure, it should apply. We should combine. So the Gemara presents similar cases to flesh out the argument. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, right from the land of Israel, to the community in Babylonia, he said if one had intent to eat half a ketzayis outside its designated area and half a ketzayis beyond its designated time, and then another half a ketzayis beyond its designated time. Okay, so place, time. So the time now are sequential. In that situation, Bar Kapara teaches that the offering is pigul. since half a ketzayis with regard to area is not effective to interfere where the intent with regard to the time concerns a whole ketzayis. Now, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, he stated a different formulation. If one had intent to eat half a ketzayis beyond its time, half a ketzayis beyond its time, and half a ketzayis outside its area, again, time, place, Bar Kapara teaches that the offering is rendered pigul, since the half of a ketzayis is not effective to interfere with the intent of pigul, which concerns a whole olive bulk, even though the pigul-related intent, was uttered in halves. The halves were sequential. And the fact that after that there was something else about place and only half a measure is not going to interfere with it. Rav Ashi teaches the law in yet a different way. He says if one had intent to eat half a ketzayis beyond its time and half of a ketzayis, and then, okay, so now he's going to utter something a little different. If one had intent to eat half a ketzayis beyond its time, and then he intended, with regard to a whole ketzayis, to eat half of it outside its area and half of it beyond its time, now Bar Kapara teaches that the offering is rendered pigul because the half of a ketzayis is not effective with respect to area to interfere where the intent of pigul concerns a whole olive bulk. Right? So interesting now that look at the subtle nuance. He's thinking, I'm going to eat half a ketzayis outside its time. Then I'm going to have a whole ketzayis that I'm going to eat in the wrong time and place, but I'm going to split it up, half wrong place, half wrong time. But he's thinking about that whole ketzayis, half of which is time, and that is close enough to the half ketzayis outside its time, even though he, utters that what he's going to do with the half of the whole with respect to area before he utters his thought about with respect to time. And so that's enough to leave the pigul in place. Okay, Rabbi Yanai says, now a whole new idea. If one had intent that dogs would eat the offering the next day. Okay, so next day is telling you outside its time. But now the intent about eating beyond its time is not that the priest is going to eat it or that some person is going to eat it, but that a dog is going to eat it. So what do we have to ask ourselves? Is a dog eating human food that's in fact part of an offering, is that considered eating? Obviously dogs love to eat, but when we're talking about eating that disqualifies offerings, is a dog eating it considered as a legal term, eating? So if one had intent that dogs would eat the offering the next day, it is pigul, as it is written, and the dogs shall eat Jezebel in the portion of Jezreel. That's from 2 Kings 9:10. And the verse indicates that consumption by dogs is considered eating. Rabbi Ami objects to this, and he says, if that is so, then if one had intent that non-sacred fire would consume it the next day, so what does that mean? You mean he's going to burn it up the next day? He's going to burn it up the next day, but that's not what he said. What he said is that non-sacred fire is going to consume it the next day. And now we're going to compare to consumption by the altar. Now, when something is consumed on the altar, it is burned in a fire, but it's a special fire, right? It's the fire of the altar pyre, which is when sacrifices are slaughtered and then parts of them are burned, which creates a satisfying aroma to heaven. What is it? Royach Nechoyach. I'm spacing right now. But a satisfying aroma. Why is it a satisfying aroma to heaven? Does God like the smell of a barbecue? Maybe he does, but what it means is that God commanded that we do something and we did it. Reach Nechoyach, right, Alan? Reach nechoyach. Yeah. And so it's a satisfying aroma. But the point is, it's consumed on the altar. So now, are we going to say that anytime you burn something, that's considered consumption? Right? And we said that if you intend to burn something on the altar, right, have it consumed on the altar beyond its time, that can also render an offering pigul right at the outset, because it's the same as consuming it by eating it, right? So does that only apply to the fires of the altar, or does that apply to any fire? Rabbi Ami objects to this. If so, then if one had intent that non-sacred fire would consume it the next day, as it is written, a fire not blown shall consume him, from Job 20:26. This too should be pigul. And if you would say that this is indeed so, well, that's difficult. But didn't we learn in the Mishna, if his intent was to eat half an olive bulk and to burn half an olive bulk, not at the appropriate time or not in the appropriate area, then the offering is fit, because eating and burning do not join together. So you can say that consuming on the altar through the altar fire, that is consuming, and maybe you can combine those, but eating and burning do not combine. We know that from another Mishnah. So what's going on? And the Gemara responds, if one expressed his intention to burn the offering in terms of consumption, it would indeed join together with intention to eat, even if it's not the fire of the altar. But in the Mishnah here, we are dealing with a case where he expressed in terms of burning, not consumption. And the two intentions do not join together, since terms of consumption and terms of burning are discrete entities. So even though it would be the same fate for that piece of the offering that will be burned up, if you express your intention in terms of burning versus consuming, it produces a different legal result. Okay, next topic. Rav Ashi raises a dilemma. If one had intent that two people would collectively eat a ketzayis, an olive bulk, then what is the law? Do we follow the intent? In which case there is the requisite measure of a full ketzayis being eaten. It's just being eaten between two people. Or do we follow the individuals who eat, and neither one of them ate the minimum measure? Abaye said, come and hear a proof from the Mishnah. If his intent was to eat half a ketzayis and to burn half a ketzayis beyond its designated time or outside the designated area, the offering is fit, because eating and burning do not join together. And it can be inferred that if one had intent to eat and to eat in a manner similar to a case of intent, or eat half a ketzayis and to burn half a ketzayis, it's different. So Abaye interjects, and what are the circumstances of such a case? It is a case with two people, i.e. where each one will consume half a ketzayis. And Abaye continues with the conclusion of his statement, then the two halves do join together, right? Because if you say that burning and eating don't combine, eating and eating should combine, and it won't make a difference if the eating is being done by two different people, if the intent at the outset of the one slaughtering or bringing the offering is thinking that, a ketzayis, a minimum measure of the olive bulk, will be eaten outside of the designated time. Even though the eating is split between two people, it will be rendered pigul. Now we're on page 31b. Rava raises a dilemma. If one had intent to eat an olive bulk in more than the period of time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, then what is the halacha? What is the law? Okay, so here again, we're testing what is the minimum measure. Now, we've said that the minimum amount of eating, for it to be called eating, is a ketzayis, an olive bulk. However, there's an additional component to the minimum measure. If you ate a ketzayis, right, an olive bulk of food over a 24-hour period, you're just nibbling a crumb at a time, that's not eating. What is eating? It's eating a ketzayis within the amount of time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. Where did they get that from? In Talmudic times, a loaf of bread was understood to mean 2 meals, right? How big is a loaf of bread? A loaf of bread is enough so that you would have enough bread for one meal and enough bread for a second meal. So half a loaf is one meal, right? So in other words, a ketzayis, if the minimum measure for a legal consequence to ensue is eating the olive bulk, the ketzayis, you have to do that within a certain amount of time. How much time? The time it takes to eat one meal. How do we measure that? The time it takes to eat half a loaf, the way that loaves were defined in Talmudic times, which is, I think, 4 to 6 egg bulks of food. Okay, so if he's not, so if he's going to be eating it slower than that, is it eating such that it would render an offering disqualified or perhaps even pigul? So let us see. Rabba raised a dilemma. If one had intent to eat a ketzayis in more than the period of time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, what is the law? Do we equate the consumption of offerings to the consumption of the Most High, i.e. the burning of offerings on the altar, for which there is no maximum allotted time? Or do we equate it to the consumption of an ordinary person, for whom consumption slower than this rate is not considered eating, legally speaking? So Abaye said, come in here, a proof from the Mishna. If his intent was to eat half a ketzayis and to burn half a ketzayis, not at the appropriate time or in the appropriate area, the offering is fit, because eating and burning do not join together. So one may infer that the reason the offering is fit is that he had intent to eat and burn the offering. But if he had intent to eat half at the normal rate and to eat half in the time it takes to eat to burn half, the two would join together. But the burning of a ketzayis of an offering can take more than the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. It therefore seems that there is no upper limit on the time which one is considered to have consumed an offering. That's a pretty roundabout way to get at this idea that eating in the too slow is still considered eating, right? They're saying that. Why? Because you can't combine eating and burning. So if you're going to substitute burning with eating at a slow rate based on the fact that burning has no maximum allotted time, we're not going to attach a maximum amount of time to the disqualification of offerings with the intent to eat beyond the time. We're not going to add a speed of eating component to that, according to this analysis. But the Gemara says no. Perhaps that Mishnah is referring to intent to burn half a ketzayis in a large fire, which can consume it in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. Accordingly, one may draw the inference only with regard to a case where his intent was to consume the halves of his ketzayis within this time. So we don't have an answer yet. Now, the Mishnah teaches if one slaughtered the animal with intent to eat half a ketzayis and burn half a ketzayis, not at the appropriate time or the appropriate area, the offering is fit, right? This is now coming back to the concept we were just using to help us draw a definition. Now we're looking at that item itself, that burning and eating do not combine, and therefore the offering remains fit. So the Gemara infers, the reason that the two halves of the ketzayis do not join together is because his intent was to eat half and to burn half. But if his intent was to eat half of meat and to eat half of an item whose typical manner is such that one does not eat of it, then the halves do join together and disqualify the offering, as both intentions concern eating. So what is an item that its normal manner is not to eat of it? That would be a burnt offering, right? Normally, the burnt offering, you slaughter it, collect its blood, sprinkle it on the altar, and then the entire animal goes up on the altar pyre and is consumed. Nobody eats of it. So if he's going to combine, he's going to combine from a sin offering and from a burnt offering, or he's going to combine, two parts from a burnt offering. The point being that even though the animal was intended to be burned on the altar, he's intending to eat some of it. Are we going to use that eating? Are we going to call that eating, even though he wasn't supposed to eat of it? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, in accordance with whose opinion is this latter clause? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says one can have intent to shift an item's consumption from consumption by a person to consumption by the altar, or from consumption by the altar to consumption by a person, because they're both considered consumption. As we learned in another Mishna on page 35a, in the case of one who slaughters the offering with intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one does not partake of it, or to burn an item whose typical manner is that one does not burn it, right? He's going to burn something that normally would be eaten. And he has that intent beyond its designated time or outside its designated area, the offering is fit, and Rabbi Eliezer deems it unfit, right? So the majority say, well, now that you're converting something that should have been burned into something that you're going to plan to eat, that's not going to take hold and disqualify the offering because this was never subject to the type of consumption that you're planning beyond its time in order to render it pigul. But Rabbi Eliezer says, well, yeah, consumption is consumption, so it should have the ability to render it pigul if you had that intent. Abaye says, you may even say that the latter clause is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, and do not say, meaning the majority, and do not say that one should infer from the Mishnah that if his intent was to eat half a ketzayis of an item normally eaten, and to eat half a ketzayis of an item whose typical manner is one that does not eat it, right, burning, then the offering is disqualified. Rather, you should formulate like this: say that one infers that if his intent was to eat half a ketzayis and to eat another half a ketzayis, both halves from an item whose typical manner is that one eats of it, then the halves join together to disqualify the offering, and then that would imply that if he combines items, half of which or all of which are not normally meant to be eaten, it would not disqualify. So the Gemara asks, if so, what is the latter clause teaching us? If it teaches us that 2 half ketzayis from an item whose typical manner is to be eaten, and they join together, so one can already learn this from the first clause of the Mishnah. If one has intent to consume half a ketzayis outside the designated area and half a ketzayis the next day, meaning beyond its designated time, the offering is disqualified. So one can infer that if his intent was to eat the first half of So one can infer that if his intent was to eat the first half ketzayis the next day, the offering would be rendered not only disqualified, but also pigul. But if one will say that this term teaches its literal meaning, that intentions to eat and burn do not join together, but one can already learn this from the inference that we drew above from the first clause of the Mishnah, namely that intent to eat an item whose typical manner is eating, it does not disqualify the offering, but intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one does not eat of it would not render it unfit. So by extension, intent to consume half a ketzayis of such an item does not join to disqualify the offering. It's complicated. Now, consider the following. And just as if when one has intent to eat of an item, just as if one has intent to eat from an item that is normally eaten, and to eat of an item whose normal manner is not to eat of it, right? Rather would be burned, his intentions do not join together, even though both intentions concern consumption. Is it necessary for the Mishnah to teach that intentions to consume and burn do not join together? The last clause, therefore, would seem unnecessary. Since it's there, we have to interpret a different way. And the Gemara answers, it was necessary for the Mishnah to explicitly address the case of where one had intent to eat and to burn, to combine eating and burning of less than the minimum measures, asking, do they combine? As it might enter your mind to say that it is only there where one's intentions are referring solely to consumption, as opposed consumption, phrasing it as consumption, whether by burning or eating, that's when they don't join together. Since he has intent to act in a way that is not consistent with the typical manner of that offering and to consume an item that is not normally consumed at all. But here, where his intent is to both eat and burn the offering, such that with regard to this half, he intends to act in a way that is consistent with its typical manner, and with regard to the other half, he intends to act in a way that is consistent with its typical manner, one might say that they should join together. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that intentions to eat and burn do not join together, period. And that is the end of chapter 2. Moving on to chapter 3, which is a continuation of chapter 2, but involves exceptions. Now we're getting back to the idea that who has to collect the blood, convey the blood, and sprinkle the blood? A priest. Who has to slaughter the offering? Now, slaughtering is an essential part of bringing an offering. If you don't slaughter it, there won't be blood to collect and sprinkle on the altar. So it's essential, but nevertheless, it doesn't have to be done by a priest. Now we're going to look more closely at this. So Mishnah number 1 of chapter 3. With regard to all those who are unfit for temple service, right? So that means either it's not a priest at all, or it's a priest who's otherwise disqualified. But again, you don't have to have a qualified priest to do the slaughtering part of this process. So with regard to all those who are unfit for temple service and who slaughtered an offering, their slaughter is valid, as the slaughter of an offering is valid ab initio when performed even by non-priests, by women, by Canaanite slaves, and by tameh individuals who are ritually impure. They don't have to be tahor, they don't have to be a man, they don't have to be free, and they don't have to be a priest in order to shecht the animal, in order to conduct the slaughter. And this is the law even with regard to offerings of the most sacred order, like sin offerings, provided that the ritually impure will not touch the flesh of the slaughtered animal. You can't make an animal tameh while it is alive. You can make it tameh when it is dead. So if it's a person who's tameh, he can't be touching the flesh of the animal after it's dead. Therefore, these unfit individuals can disqualify the offering with prohibited intent. Even though they're not priests, even though they're unfit to do other parts of the temple service, since they are fit to shecht the animal, if they have improper intent, like eating part of the animal beyond its designated time, they would disqualify the animal, and they could even render it pigul, even though they're disqualified from conducting other parts of the temple service, which only priests can do. Furthermore, and now we're on page 32a, and with regard to all of them, in a case where they collected the blood with the intent to offer it beyond its designated time or outside the designated area, if there is blood of the soul that remains in the animal, the priest who is fit for temple service should again collect the blood and sprinkle it on the altar, right? Which is to tell you that a person who is unfit to conduct the temple service may slaughter the animal, but he may not collect the blood, convey it to the altar, and sprinkle it. However, if he did collect the blood, convey it, or sprinkle it, he would not render the offering permanently disqualified. You have an instant replay opportunity, a do-over opportunity, that now if there's enough blood of the soul remaining so that a person who is fit to conduct the temple service, right, a priest who's not otherwise disqualified, could go and collect some of that blood, bring it over to the altar and sprinkle it, and the offering would remain qualified and, in good form, so to speak, in good standing. If the priest fit for the temple service collected the blood in a vessel, and then he handed the vessel to an unfit person, that person should return it to the fit priest, meaning you didn't disqualify it, you just have to get back on track. If the priest collected the blood in a vessel in his right hand and he moved it to his left hand, he should return it to his right hand, right? Because we saw that priests have to collect the blood with their right hand. So if he then handed it to his left hand, okay, shouldn't have done that. We can fix it. Bring it back to the right hand. If the priest collected the blood in a sacred vessel and then he placed it in a non-sacred vessel, he should return it. He should return the blood to a sacred vessel. But he can't collect it in a non-sacred vessel. It has to be collected in a sacred vessel. Then if it got transferred to a non-sacred vessel, if they finished the service that way, it would be disqualified, but we have the do-over opportunity, return it to a sacred vessel and proceed from there. If the blood spilled from the vessel onto the floor, and he gathered it from the floor, it is still valid. You can get, if it fell on the floor, you can put it back in the sacred vessel and continue the service. If an unfit person placed the blood upon the ram, right, sprinkled the blood, or on the wall of the altar that is not opposite the base of the altar, or if he placed the blood that is to be placed below the red line above the red line, or if he placed the blood that is to be placed above the red line below the red line, or if he placed the blood that is to be placed inside the sanctuary, outside the sanctuary, or the blood that is to be placed outside the sanctuary, inside the sanctuary, all of these would be mistakes if a priest did it. But now we have an unfit person doing it. Then the priest fit for temple service should again collect the blood and sprinkle it on the altar. This tells you that if the person sprinkled the blood, the unfit person sprinkled the blood in the correct place, then the offering is disqualified. But as long as he made a mistake when he sprinkled it, we can now bring in a fit person and he can complete the process correctly. And that is the Mishnah. Now the Gemara of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 3. The Gemara infers from the use of the past tense in the Mishnah with regard to all those who are unfit for the temple service who slaughtered, past tense. We infer from this that after the fact, yes, the slaughter is valid, but ab initio, no, those who are unfit may not slaughter an offering. Right? So, okay, it shouldn't have been done that way. A priest should do all aspects of it, including slaughter. But if an unfit person did the slaughter, okay, it's not disqualified. But if we have a choice at the outset, we should only have a priest do the slaughter. That's what the Gemara is inferring now. Is that true? And the Gemara raises a contradiction from what was taught in the halachic midrash known as Toras Kohanim. The verse states with regard to the burnt offering in Leviticus 1:5, quote, and he shall slaughter the bull before the Lord. Now, the fact that the verse does not stipulate that a priest must slaughter the offering teaches that slaughter is valid if performed by a non-priest, as was stated in the Mishnah like this. As the sacrificial rite of slaughter is valid when performed by non-priests, by women, by Canaanite slaves, and by ritually impure individuals, and even with regard to offerings of the most sacred order. Or, meaning, so what do you mean ab initio it should be done by a priest? Sounds like a non-priest can do it, period. It doesn't matter. Even at the outset, we could choose to have a non-priest do it, and it would be okay. Or, perhaps, the term, and he shall slaughter, in this verse, the he is referring to priests. It means priests. Pronoun, okay, but it meant a priest. Now, you can say in response, from where did you come to the idea that that verse is referring only to a priest? It is from the fact that it is stated to Aaron, the first high priest, and you and your sons with you shall keep your priesthood and everything that pertains to the altar. That's Numbers 18:7. Now, one might have thought that this is the law even with regard to slaughter, that only priests are fit to slaughter an offering. Therefore, the verse states, and he shall slaughter the bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall present the blood. That's a continuation of Leviticus 1:5. And from this we infer that specifically from the collection of the blood and onward, it is a mitzvah exclusively of the priesthood. This teaches about the right of slaughter, shechting, that it is valid ab initio if performed by any person. And this contradicts the inference from the Mishnah that slaughter of an offering by a non-priest is valid only after the fact. The Gemara answers, the same is true that even ab initio, as well it is permitted for those unfit for temple service to slaughter an offering, but because the Mishnah wants to teach with regard to the ritually impure that they may not slaughter an offering ab initio due to a rabbinic decree, lest they touch the flesh and render it ritually impure, right? It would be okay for a tamei person to slaughter as long as he doesn't touch the flesh, but then the rabbis issued a decree, no, we're not going to let a tamei person slaughter because it's so likely that he will touch the animal after he's just killed it, rendering the offer tamei as a fence around the Torah. We're not going to let a tamei person shecht. That tells you that the other types of unfitness, Canaanite slave, non-priest, woman, etc., they can slaughter even ab initio. And the Gemara asks, let me just read that again. So the same is true that even ab initio as well, it is permitted for those unfit for the temple service to slaughter the offering. But because the Mishnah wants to teach with regard to the ritually impure that they may not slaughter an offering ab initio due to the rabbinic decree, lest they touch the flesh and render it ritually impure. Therefore, the Mishnah was worded in this way and taught the law with the expression in the past tense, who slaughtered, i.e. after the fact. Like, that's why it was worded in the past tense, not to say that ab initio, all those other unfit people, should not slaughter. And the Gemara asks, and in the case of a tamei person who performed the slaughter, is it permitted even after the fact? And one can raise a contradiction from what is taught in the halakhic midrash in Torah's Kohanim, that the Torah states two consecutive directives. Quote, and he shall place his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and he shall slaughter the bull before the Lord. That's Leviticus 1:4 and 1:5. Now, this juxtaposition indicates that both directives are referring to the same individual. And this teaches that, just as placing hands on the head of an offering may be performed only by a tahor person, ritually pure person, so too the slaughter may be performed only by ritually pure individuals. And the Gemara answers, by rabbinic law, an impure person is prohibited from slaughtering an offering lest he touch the flesh of the offering. But by Torah law, the slaughtering would be valid. And the Gemara asks, what is different about placing hands that it can be performed only by those who are tahor, even by Torah law? Again, you can't transmit tumah to a living animal. So why is it that smicha, placing hands on the offering before you bring it, has to be done by a person who is tahor, ritually pure? What is the reason? Or why is this different? It is that it is written before the Lord, the phrase before the Lord, which is referring to the temple courtyard. Before the Lord means in the place that the Lord designated as the place to bring offerings. And an impure person may not enter the temple courtyard. So with regard to shechting, to slaughter as well, isn't it written before the Lord? So how can a ritually impure person even be in the temple courtyard to do the slaughtering? So the Gemara answers, well, it is possible for a tamei person to do the slaughtering without entering the courtyard. How? In a case where he fashions a very long knife and he stands outside the temple courtyard and he slaughters the offering that is inside the courtyard. Again, this is only in the realm of the hypothetical, because why would you ever do that? It's a very weird situation, but we are testing our understanding of the law. So the Gemara asks, with regard to placing hands also, it is possible in a case where he inserts his hands into the temple courtyard and places them on the head of the offering, but the rest of his body is outside the temple courtyard. And the Gemara answers that the Tana of our Mishnah holds that a partial entry, in which only a part of the body enters the temple courtyard, is entry. Therefore, an impure individual may not insert even part of his body, such as his hands, into the temple courtyard. He could extend a long knife in, because his hand is still outside the temple courtyard, but to do smicha, he would have to, put his hands at least in the airspace of the temple courtyard, and that is being in the temple courtyard, and a tamei person cannot do that. Rav Chizda taught the Baraisa in the opposite manner. And he shall place his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and he shall slaughter the bull. This teaches that just as slaughter may be performed only by ritually pure individuals, so too placing hands may be performed only by ritually pure individuals. And the Gemara asks, what is different about slaughter that it may be performed only by those who are ritually pure? It is that it is written with regard to it, before the Lord, which refers to the temple courtyard, and a ritually impure person may not enter the temple courtyard. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. We're at the top of page 32b. With regard to placing hands on the head of an offering as well, it is written before the Lord. And so the Gemara answers that it is possible in the case where he inserts his hands into the temple courtyard and places them on the head of the offering while he remains outside. And the Gemara asks, but with regard to slaughter also, it is possible if he fashions a long knife to do the slaughtering. And the Gemara answers in accordance with whose opinion is this? It is in accordance with the opinion of Shimon Hatimni, who holds that the one who slaughters an offering must be standing in the temple courtyard. He can't just extend a long knife into it. His feet have to be on the floor of the temple courtyard. And this is as it is taught in a Baraisa, that when the verse states, and he shall slaughter the bull before the Lord in Leviticus 1:5, it teaches that the bull must be inside the temple courtyard, but the slaughterer need not be before the Lord. Therefore, he may stand outside the temple courtyard and slaughter the offering that is inside. And that sounds like the opposite of what we're saying, except that in that teaching, the minority opinion of Shimon Hatimni says, from where is it derived that the hands of the slaughterer must be farther inside the temple courtyard than the animal that is slaughtered? The verse states, and he shall slaughter the bull before the Lord. And this teaches that the slaughterer, the person doing the shechting of the bull, must be before the Lord, meaning he's got to be standing in the courtyard. We'll cut it off there. Take a couple of questions or comments. We have a few. My thing is reloading. Boom, boom, boom. Reload, Google Docs, reload. Meanwhile, while this is reloading, we're excited that it's almost Shabbos. And, I was away with some family, some extended family, not all of whom are religious. So I was in a context where I was eating my kosher meal, which was, wrapped in double aluminum foil so that it could be heated up in an oven that's not kosher. And, I was eating my kind of lame looking TV dinner type of meal while the people around me were eating, magnificent plates of food that were not kosher. And I remember thinking, they must think that us religious people, it's so limiting what we eat. We don't get to eat nice meals like them, at least in that context. But, I probably should have mentioned, but I didn't want to. It wasn't good for the conversation at the moment, but what I was thinking is, yeah, I'm eating a lame TV dinner while you're eating that magnificent plate of food here at this vacation spot. But every Friday night, we eat the equivalent of a full Thanksgiving meal. And recently in the holidays, it was like we're having Thanksgiving meal after Thanksgiving meal after Thanksgiving meal, night after night after night. So, you don't have to feel bad for us religious people. We eat magnificent meals, just not in that kind of vacation spot context. Okay, Bill, surely it occurs to me, if the priest is contemplating eating the whole olive bulk, but split up in such a way that he's not eating the whole olive bulk at once, he's employing artifice, and the split doesn't matter at all. Okay, it's a very interesting question. Bill is saying that, what does he mean by employing artifice? It means that he is intentionally splitting it up in his mind so that he won't constitute the minimum measure, and therefore it would not render the offering unfit because he split it up into smaller portions than the minimum measure. And I guess the answer that the sages would say to you that is, yeah, well, if he didn't use the artifice correctly, he will trigger the disqualification and pigul. And so that's exactly why we have to understand what the law is so that we can determine, did artifice apply? Was it used correctly? Did we trigger the minimum measure? Right? And so it sounds like if he split a half, if he says, I'm going to eat a half beyond the time and I'm going to eat a half beyond the time, sort of two distinct halves that are less than the minimum measure, but they're sequential in thought and in his plan, what he'll do later, they would combine. And maybe he thought they wouldn't, but they did. I think that's how I understand that. It's a good question. Joseph, considering in all of this, we are dealing with the temple where the presence of God was, where reason and legal rationality ends, would not God himself indicate if an offering is acceptable or not? Not necessarily as drastic as a priest being consumed in fire, but something obvious nonetheless. Fascinating question, Joseph. So what Joseph is alluding to, especially in the times of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and then later when Solomon built the first temple, there were ongoing miracles, right? Ongoing miracles, like that the altar pyre, its smoke would rise in a vertical column, even on a windy day. That when the fire needed to be lit, a fire from heaven would light it. And there were 10 ever-present miracles. Like the showbreads would remain fresh from Shabbos to Shabbos, right? Even though it's like fresh baked bread that everybody knows that, a few hours later, certainly a day later, fresh baked bread is not fresh baked bread anymore. But the showbreads on the table in the sanctuary would remain warm and fresh all week. And when they were replaced the following week and then the portions distributed to the priests that were serving the temple, it was like they were receiving fresh baked bread. So while it is true that there were ongoing miracles like that, we don't have a record, as far as I know, not in the Gemara, certainly not in the Torah, of God, interfering and saying, this is qualified, this is not. That he did leave that to us. And it's interesting because I was just reading from this week's Torah portion this morning about Noah, right? About the size of the ark. Right? So it's very interesting when you analyze the size of Noah's ark. Was it big enough to hold a male and a female of every species on earth? No. No way. Right? I mean, there are multiple species of elephants. There are multiple species of rhinoceri. There are multiple species of hippopotami. Is that the plural? There are lots of really large animals that have multiple species of them. And even if you just say there's only one kind of hippopotamus, only one kind of rhinoceros, but every kind of large animal, every kind of deer and okapi and kudu, and there's just so many animals in the world that if you took male and female of each and you looked at the size of the ark, they weren't going to fit in there. So how did they fit in there? Miraculously. So if it's going to fit in there miraculously anyway, sort of like, I think in one of the Harry Potter books, right? Like the inside was much, much larger than the outside because there it's magic, but in this case it's miraculous. So then why was the ark, not the size basically of a, 16-foot sailboat? If the inside is going to be miraculously large anyway, why make the outside kind of big? Impressively big, but not nearly big enough to hold all the animals. So it had to be, large enough to impress the other people in the world that this guy Noah is building an ark and telling everybody, because God's going to destroy the world because there's so much evil in it, please repent what you're doing, so that God doesn't have to destroy the world. And Noah was building the ark for over 100 years. Think about that. For a century, this guy was working on a boat and saying God is really irked by all the evil in the world. He's going to destroy the world unless people repent. And so there's this combination of God's input into the world, God guiding the affairs of man, and people have to do what they do. So even though there were some ever-present miracles so that you knew that the Shekhinah was there, right, the manifest presence of the Lord was in the Holy Temple, nevertheless, God was expecting the priests in the early days and later the rabbis to help the priests understand what's kosher and what's not, what's qualified and what's disqualified, what's fit and what's unfit. And God is not going to come in and say, this is fit, this is unfit, this is qualified, this is disqualified, for the same reason. And Sharon, how does all this square with the multiple sacrifices pre-Torah going all the way to Bereshit? So Sharon is saying we have a tradition that the patriarchs and matriarchs, right, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, were keeping the Torah even before the Torah was given. So one of the things that they were doing was bringing sacrifice. Now at that time, of course, there was no temple, and so it was permitted to bring sacrifices in other places. And so, for example, you have Abraham when he comes into the land, Jacob when he returns to the land, setting up an altar and bringing offerings to the Lord. And so I guess Sharon is asking, were they aware that they had to, the parts that they were going to burn needed to be burned, and the parts that were going to be eaten needed to be eaten within a certain amount of time? And if they didn't eat it within that certain amount of time, or if they had an intent to eat it beyond that allotted time, they would disqualify the offering entirely. Did they know that? Or did they just instinctively do it the right way? Great question. I don't know. My gut tells me that they just had an instinct that, we're bringing the offering, we're going to eat it today. And they didn't let any of it sit beyond that because it would be unseemly for an offering of the Lord. But I don't know more than that. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, right? Shabbos is ending earlier and earlier. And I think maybe in 2 weeks we change the clocks. And then it'll be really much easier, especially for my East Coast people, to attend class on Saturday night. But candlelighting this week, I don't know, 6:40 something, 6:50. So, about an hour and 15 to an hour and 30 minutes later than that LA time. Look forward to see you then, my holy sisters and brothers. Until then, have a good Shabbos, and may we hear only good news going in, during, and coming out of Shabbos. All the best.